David Engels, welcome to the Prokhof Center and the Global Humanities Initiative.
Hello, Henk. Thank you very much for your invitation.
David, you're a historian and a classicist, a professor of Roman history at the University of Brussels in Belgium. You're the author of a book which was published in 2013 and caused quite a stir and was discussed and is still being discussed very intensely. It came out first in French. This is the one called Le Déclin, la crise de l'Union européenne et la chute de la République romaine, the decline, the crisis of the European Union and the fall of the Roman Republic. And there's also a German version of it which is called Auf dem Weg ins Imperium, on the way to empire. Can you try and explain to us what it is that you're trying to do in these in the book? Because you draw a parallel, don't you, between the Roman Republic and the fall of the Roman Republic back then and the European Union today.
Exactly, even if the parallel is even more with the idea of the West and of Europe than about with the European Union specifically. And indeed, I'm trying or tried in that book to show how finally many of the factors leading up to the downfall of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC are quite in analogy with many of the crisis factors we also see in nowadays Western world. There are many factors, if you want me to enumerate some of them, for example.
Yeah, so you've got the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, and you see a number of crisis phenomena there, and you're saying, well, actually, if we're now looking at the European Union, we're seeing very much the same phenomena. Could you give some examples of that?
Yeah, I tried to divide my book in 12 parts, which correspond also incidentally to 12 identity patterns or identity factors described by the European Union itself in order to, in some of the statistics, with the aim of defining European identity. So I tried to show, for example, how the family is changing, how demographies are attained today by this crisis. I tried to show how globalization is a phenomenon that was also known in the Roman Republic. I tried to discuss falling birth rates. I tried to show that the decline of traditional Christian confessions is also very similar to the decline of the Roman Republican religion. I tried to speak also about features such as criminality, about the rise of asymmetric wars, about technocracy, about a loss of civic participation in the state. I'm talking about the problem of diminution of jobs, for example.
Could you be a little bit more concrete on that? So take the situation of the family, for example. How do you think that's similar to the Roman Republic and the European Union? What are the parallels there?
It's very interesting to see that in the 2nd and the 1st century BC, we see in Rome and in the Hellenistic world and in general a certain rise of an individualistic outlook on life that affects, of course, also the place of the individual within its city and affects also family life. We see that, for example, the divorce rate is or seems to be rising dramatically. We see that birth rate is falling. We see a very individualistic, sometimes very egoistic outlook also on personal life and personal fulfillment. So many things we generally attach to the concept of modernity, which we find already in the Mediterranean world of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, for example.
Right, and what about globalization? Because when people talk about globalization, they think of sort of the post-1945 world, or even later than that, and you're saying you see similar phenomena in the Roman Republic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in the European world, globalization is a phenomenon that goes way back into the 19th, sometimes even 18th century. So that is a rising phenomenon that becomes, of course, more and more obvious today. And it is interesting to see, in my view, that what we call often globalization in today's Western world is, in fact, not necessarily the equal exchange between cultural produces or elements between the different parts of the globe, but rather an export of a Western way of life to China, to India, to Africa. So it's a global spread of a typically Western way of life, production mechanism, technology, everywhere throughout the globe. And it's interesting to see that exactly in the 2nd and 1st century BC, we have the phenomenon of Romanization, which is quite similar also to what we see a bit before, that is the Hellenization of the Eastern Mediterranean, which means the spread of Roman Hellenistic forms of life throughout the whole Mediterranean and the regions under Hellenistic or Roman domination. And it is one of the very promising field of research in the last years also, that the phenomenon of Romanization is more and more understood as a very early version of what we call today globalization. Lots of research projects on that.
Yeah, could you give some concrete examples of that? If people talk about globalization, they immediately, they think of McDonald's in China and that kind of thing. So we kind of know what that is. What was Romanization then? So what kind of influence did the Romans have on the world around them?
Yeah, well, there are many examples. Of course, there's on the one hand, there's the spread of the Latin language, of the Greek language everywhere in their domain of domination, exactly as English today. There is, of course, also the impact of typically Greek and Roman elements of architecture, of building, of urban landscapes, for example, which we see also everywhere and which everyone knows, because it suffices that I show you, for example, the images of a Roman temple in ruins, and if I ask you, well, do you think that temple is in today's Tunisia, in Britain, in Spain, or somewhere in the Balkans, you wouldn't probably be able to answer it. I couldn't also. So that sees how far this cultural koine is spreading. But it's also on an economic point of view. The Mediterranean in the Roman Empire is tightly interconnected. There are very intense flows of products which are exported from Egypt to Italy, from Asia Minor to Africa, with also a very strong financial interdependence between the center and the periphery, exactly as we see it also today. So there are many factors that are quite similar to the 1st century BC.
From the way you've described it now, it sounds relatively sort of neutral, but I think if you look at the overall picture, it's quite negative, isn't it? I mean, I wrote down some of the characteristics typical of the Roman Republic and of the European Union that you identify. The declining birth rate, as you just said, but also political immobilism, an increasing gap between the ruling elite and the ordinary people, a kind of ethical rudderlessness, so that people no longer know what to believe or whom to believe. You see that perhaps in America as well. We'll come back to that in a moment when we talk about the European Union and America. But Donald Trump always talking about the fake media, so we no longer know, whom should we believe. There's also a kind of identity crisis, that people no longer know what they are, both as individuals and as peoples, as nations, which we perhaps see in something like Brexit, where people desperately trying to hang on to a certain conception of Britain, which arguably is actually rather outdated. And then there's a whole the multicultural situation, which we don't seem to be handling very well, and that's the same in was the same in the Roman Republic as well. That's right. It's actually it's largely a situation of decline.
Decline is, of course, a moral term. As a historian, I prefer to avoid it. And unfortunately, it's, of course, on the title of the French edition of my book, but it wasn't my idea, but the idea of my publishers, so I was not really positive for that. So I try to avoid the notion of decline, but it is true that there is a huge number of negative elements, or of elements which are conceived or which are perceived as negative, which is the dark side of modernity as we know it today, and as we had it also in the Roman Republic. Indeed, the late Roman Republic was a period of identity crisis. We have, for example, Cicero, who is complaining about the fact that he and his fellow countrymen are walking throughout Rome, but they do not know anymore what the magistracies are for. They do not know what their gods are for. They do not know the name of their prayers and so on. So there's a loss of shared identity, which is really deplored also by the contemporaries. There's the problem of immigration, of course, that puts on that on the table the problem of what is identity, to what degree multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism is good for the city or not. There's a whole debate on that also, on Hellenistic philosophy.
Could you say a little bit more about that debate? I don't know, you don't have to quote, I don't know whether you know the quotation by heart or partly by heart, but some of the discussions that I have had in ancient Rome about immigration, do you remember some authors or some quotations where they focus or zoom in on that specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that there has been a couple even of law projects expulsing foreigners on the grounds that they were not
true Romans.
Roman enough, and that they had no right of living in Rome. And of course, we have a huge load of very xenophobic also descriptions of foreigners living in Rome. Some coming from the Republic. Many also from the early empire. For example, Juvenal is a very nice example in his criticism of the many Syrians living in Rome, and whom he describes he loathed. So there's quite a lot of that in the ancient sources.
Was that a discussion? So you say Juvenal was complaining about all these Syrians coming to Rome. Whether then other writers who are writing against this or putting forward so trying to make the case for these foreigners?
Yeah, for example, Cicero, there are some quotations also which show that they already had a very differentiated approach towards the problem of immigration. Cicero says, for example, that it is only logic that foreigners do not necessarily exert the rights of citizenship in the town they are moving to, but that on the other hand, expulsing them from the city is against the laws of humanity. So we already see a very nuanced debate on rights of citizenship, rights of humanity, of humanism, and that is a discussion we have during the whole late Republic, even in the early Empire. What does it mean to be a true Roman, and how should it be defined? Should it only be defined, as it is often the case in Rome, as it is today, through purely universalist, humanist values, or should it be defined rather by typically ethnic, religious, cultural categories? The whole debate we have today can be found also, often in a fragmentary way, of course, in the ancient sources.
And really you do two things in a book, don't you? You do the description, that is a very extensive analysis of all the historical analogies and parallels between the Roman Republic and the European Union. But then at the end of the book, you also venture a prognosis. You say this is the way it might go, or maybe the way it's already going. And you do that using two key terms, one empire and the other one Caesarism. Can you explain to us what you mean by that? Start with empire. So the German book is actually called On the Way to Empire, and you're saying the European Union is on the way to empire. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I couldn't refrain from the temptation of playing all that game of analogies in future times. I mean, I could have, as you said, I could have ended the book with the end of the comparison of the actual state of affairs with the late Roman Republic, but I found it interesting to play the game and to think, well, what would happen if these analogies continue in the future? What if we are now living at the moment roughly corresponding to the 60s, 50s BC? What would be then our future in the next year? And that is why I, of course, predicted, if my analogies are true, I predicted or feared a period of civil war, or civil unrest, not unlike the civil wars that have torn the Roman Republic in the 50s, in the 40s, in the 30s, and then the advent on the ruins of this wrecked Roman Republic of a new form of government, that is the Augustan Principate, the Roman Empire, as we often call it, as a some kind of compromise. On the one hand between the necessity of confirming power the ruling elite, the senatorial elite, which lost much credit, of course, in the late Roman Republic, exactly as our political elites today, and which needed visibly to be checked by another more popular power, and of course the people who felt more and more excluded from the actual exercise of power during during the late Roman Republic, explaining the rise of populism and of many people like Claudius, like Catilina, like Caesar, of course, and then Augustus. And so the empire or the principate presented itself as a compromise, I would say, between these two elements. And that seems for me a prognosis not as far-fletched as it may seem, also for the European Union, where we often have the complaint that it is not democratic enough, that it needs more plebiscitary components. And on the other hand, what we also hear very often, that modernity is something very complicated and needs a more technocratical government to face all these problems.
So on the one hand, you've got maybe more technocracy or maybe more ordinary people involved, but then on the other hand, you see in the Roman Republic the rise of the strongman, Augustus, Caesar, and other people. And you're also saying that the European Union is moving towards Caesarism. Isn't that right? Or maybe even the world is moving to Caesarism. Are you thinking there of people like the strongman, of the world, like Trump and Erdogan and Duterte in the Philippines and so on?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, I'm operating also in the book with a concept which is larger than only the European Union, which figures obviously on the title, but it's more about the West. And of course, the United States belong absolutely to the West, and which is why Trump is so interesting. But not only Trump. I mean, you have the equivalent also in Europe, with people like Le Pen, for example, or like the AfD now in Germany. This rather populist
Germany, and people
exactly.
Like Geert Wilders in Holland, that's right.
Absolutely, and these people seem for me not necessarily already Caesarist figures, because we are not yet in a situation where politicians take power in their hands by military means, but it's still rather the populist phase, as we have it also in the late Roman Republic, with people, as I said, like Catilina, like Claudius, these popular tribunes in some way, who belong generally also to the political faction of the populares, or the populist party in some way, even if you can't, of course, translate all this one-to-one from Rome to today. And so I see in them symptoms for the fact that we are slowly approaching this stage, which is a very difficult and dangerous state, because as you mentioned it beforehand, we are heading towards a growing paralysis of our political system, where the established political forces do not anymore have the majorities they need to govern. Or we see it in France with the breakdown of the Conservative and the Socialist Party. And on the other hand, we have the populists who cannot yet, and who probably will never really rise to a position of power strong enough to govern wholly the state. We see it with Trump, who is unable, of course, to make use of the huge American bureaucracy. So he is putting also the USA in a stage of paralysis. And that's what happened also in the late Roman Republic, where neither the senatorial aristocracy nor the populist leaders were able to put into or to realize the reforms which were so necessary for the Roman state, and this absence led to the civil wars.
What role do political parties play in this? You mentioned basically the decline of political parties in the European Union. Mm-hmm. So you see, as you say, Macron in France, neither Republican nor socialist. Or you see in the United States, for example, Donald Trump, mm-hmm. who is a Republican in name, but doesn't seem to share that many values with the traditional Republican mm-hmm. Party. Bernie Sanders was an independent and then ran as a Democrat, but again was basically an independent candidate. Do you see similar phenomena in the Roman Republic? Did they have something approaching political parties?
There were not political parties in the old ideological way of socialism, liberalism. It was rather groups of persons. But of course, these persons had shared interest and also a common outlook on politics. There were, of course, two main parties. There, on the one hand, there was what was called the Populares, and on the other, the Optimates, which were rather the established parties or the established factions. And it is. I think rather curious to see that towards the end of the Roman Republics, all the old divisions between factions, between families, between even type of parties tended to break down, only in order to check the danger of populism. We see it, for example, in Cicero, who is calling for a concordia of all good people, regardless to what faction they belong, only in order to check people like Catilina, like Claudius, like later on partly also Caesar. That is exactly what is happening also today in France, for example, where you see that the old parties are dissolving, and that there is this new Macron movement, which is ideologically not quite clearly defined, which is rising, some kind of not new party, but cordon sanitaire.
That's right. So the old parties are sort of disintegrating.
Yeah.
And you've got Macron instead, but what's left of the old political parties, then they do bond together to at least keep Marine Le Pen out. And you say that's very similar to what happened
exactly.
in the Roman
What we had
Republic.
in Germany, where often the great coalitions between the left and the right is becoming a standard phenomenon in nearly all European countries, where the cordon sanitaire against populism becomes a known party, a party on its own way, at least in reality. And that is, of course, very dangerous, because on the one hand it tends to dissolve all the original ideological orientations. It makes it very difficult to address political reforms at these new parties or new the populists and who are against them are so mixed up groups that it is very difficult for them, of course, to propose consistent political reforms, provoking the fact that, as in the Roman state, there is a growing immobility, a growing paralysis, which then leads sooner or later to the outbreak of unrest, because the state can't check anymore the many factors of crisis which are mounting everywhere in Rome, as also in the West today.
Final question on this: where do you see the laws and the legal system going? Are they being undermined as well? I mean, when you talk about Caesarism and the rise of the strong man, and the disintegration of traditional political parties and traditional ideologies, that all sounds quite worrying. Is it so worrying that also laws might disappear, that liberal democracy itself is on the verge of collapse?
That is very possible. If you, I mean, there are a couple of examples where you see clearly that political correctness or some kind of consensus of established parties is for the moment much more important, much more powerful than the law or the spirit of the law. Think, for example, about the referenda on the European Constitution, where you have this very absurd situation, as in Ireland, that if the outcome of the referendum is not necessarily what is wanted, well, you repeat the referendum until the right result is obtained. When I think about France, where the people in majority was against the constitution, and then the parliament said, well, anyway, we sign it under the form of the Treaty of Lisbon. So very obviously there is a growing gap between the democratic legitimation on the one hand and its bending, shaping by political correctness. You see it also in Germany, for example. Very recently, the AfD normally had to provide the Alterspräsident of the German parliament, and because, of course, the majority of the parliament was against the fact that one member of the populist party would be the elderly head of the parliament, they simply changed the laws in order to make it not the oldest member, but the oldest in action or some other ways, in order to circumvent the initial law, to be sure that the AfD didn't gain this position. There are, of course, many other laws nowadays who tend in that system, who show that the system tries to prevent or to stabilize its own power, even if it means of changing the rules of the game, which were
to the extent that then also people start losing faith in the system, because they're saying, look, they're just doing it to protect their own interests that they've always had, and sort of what Donald Trump always said, says that the system is rigged against the people.
Yeah, that is, of course, very simplistic, as everything Trump says. But in its essence, it is true that how can you continue to sell a system like the system of the European Union or many of our national state system as being democratic if the outcome of a referendum, if it is not okay, well, you repeat it until you have the right result. That is the so you can only lead democracy ad absurdum, and it is not astonishing that many people who think that if democracy means that, well, why not vote for an anti-democratic party, as democracy seems lost anyway, or as we have now and in Rome also, the very absurd situation that populist and very often anti-democratic parties claim of being much more democratic than the established democratic parties. So we have a revirement of situations very reminiscent of the laments of the Roman people in the late Roman Republic, who did not anymore find their voice heard by the traditional aristocracy, senatorial aristocracy, and thus turned to more demagogic characters, and at the end finally submitted to Augustus, whom they considered as being finally more democratic, more plebiscitary than the republic they had before. And I think there's a great risk of something similarly happening also in Europe and the West.
David, we've looked at some of the parallels between the Roman Republic and the European Union, and the way the European Union is now, and you also try to project it into the future. What I want to do in the second part of the interview is maybe look at some of the possible problems with that kind of analysis, and also explore possible alternatives that are hopefully a little bit less bleak than the things you've talked about. We'll do that in the second part.
Fine.